Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to thank the Ambassador O'Malley and his hardworking, energetic staff for bringing me here today, and thank you to everyone for attending. In the agenda, I noticed that this talk is given the rather hopeful subtitle, Lightning Talk. So I'm going to try to emulate this quality in the flash and flicker of a few slides. First, for those of you who don't know, the National Endowment for the Arts is an independent federal agency of the US government. The NEA funds and supports projects involving creativity, arts engagement, and arts education across the United States for the benefit of individuals and communities. But increasingly, the NEA has been promoting knowledge and understanding of the role of creativity, not only in the arts, and how it might be nurtured and optimized. And in fact, one of the cool things about my job, I suppose, is the ability to from an arts perspective, to start to, as Susan was alluding to, really quantify and use empirical data to talk about the value of arts and culture in America. And there aren't many roles for government employees to do that kind of work, and it's really fascinating, and it's I think actually on the cutting edge of a lot of work around the social sciences and economics, for example. One example of some work we've done before I just go right into the presentation is to tell you that last year we sponsored a symposium at the Santa Fe Institute, which is a well-known kind of think tank in the US, to look at some of the latest research around creativity in the brain. And we brought together psychologists, neuroscientists, people in neurotechnology to understand really what is going on when people are creative, and how is there something, so to speak, we can distill and understand better in terms of catalyzing that creativity in people. And so we'll be releasing a report later this year on that. But today I'm going to be talking about a research inquiry into another dimension of creativity, not the neuroscientific, but the economic one. The findings I'll share come from a historic partnership between the US Department of Commerce, specifically the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the National Endowment for the Arts to map the contributions of arts and culture to the US economy. These data are enabled through a mechanism called a satellite account, used to track the final economic value of goods and services that otherwise would go hidden within the Bureau of Economic Analysis main accounts, which are used to compute the nation's GDP, gross domestic product, on a quarterly basis. Many countries have envisioned or have developed satellite accounts. The UK, France, Canada, Australia, and several Latin American countries, for example. And often these accounts are about arts and cultural or creative industries in general. While these data the data I'm going to be talking about today speak only to arts and cultural industries, I think you'll agree that the categories are fairly broad while remaining somewhat stringent. And this allows us to measure the economic value of, if not all creativity in the US economy, then a substantial part of it. And again, part of the news here is that this can actually be quantified. Now, you may not know this to look at me, but one of my dreams since late adolescence has been to come to Ireland because of this man, William Butler Yeats. I can just say that in preparation for this presentation, and this is risky to say this in front of a room of his countrymen, but I went through his oeuvre, I rummaged his collected works, as I often raid through, and looking for a quote that I could throw up at the beginning, and I'm sorry to say that I'm deprived of that opportunity. I didn't find a killer quote on the creative economy. Whatever Yeats's strengths are, I didn't find that. That said, I turned to one of the figures he helped to launch in the Western world, Rabindranath Tagore, his fellow Nobel laureate in literature, whose work I also knew thanks to a Bengali-speaking mom. And I found that there's actually an English essay he wrote, I think in 1922, called Creative Unity. In it he says, "The one question before all others that has to be answered by our civilizations is not what they have and in what quantity, but what they express and how." And I see that as not necessarily a reproach to measuring. I actually see that as an invitation to look at, try to substantiate what we often write off as intangible. And so he goes on, "Our activities of production and enjoyment of wealth attain that spirit of wholeness when they are blended with their creative ideal. Otherwise, they have the insane aspect of the eternally unfinished." So that's not bad. It's fitting, perhaps, that Tagore himself inspired and even named a future Nobel laureate in economics, Amartya Sen. Yet, how does this tie into what we're doing in the US? So if you take the words he said, I would say that the US Department of Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker nailed it when referring to the project I'm speaking about today. She said, The positive value of arts and culture on society has been understood on a human level for millennia. With this new effort, however, we are now able to quantify the impact of arts and culture on GDP for the very first time. So in thinking about the findings, short findings I'm going to present to you, I thought I'd lead with this one, since this is an international themed audience. Arts and cultural commodities are actually giving the US a trade surplus. That is to say, if you follow US economics internationally, I mean, essentially most sectors in the economy in general, I might add, in the US, is actually running a trade deficit where we're importing more than we export. This is not true with arts and cultural goods and services. We're actually running a surplus of about $25 billion. That's represented by the difference between the two lines shown here. We actually have data through this account going back from 1998 all the way through 2012, which is the most recent year for which we're collecting data. We're in the process of updating this. But it's pretty substantial. And I think two things that are also worth noting is that generally speaking, it's understood that trade surpluses are associated with job growth, economic stability. And I only wish I could track for you what dimension, what component of this is actually coming from Irish American generated work. I can't, however, yet. Hopefully someday we'll get the data that detailed enough. So where is this coming from, though? I can tell you, though, that if you look at the top export categories, what are they? They're movies, TV shows, not surprising perhaps, accounting for about $16 billion worth of exports. But also manufactured jewelry and silverware. Now, we don't just throw everything in the bucket and say that's creative. We actually look at lapidary workmanship, kind of jewelry, silverware, certain classes of silverware and jewelry, and that actually, is the manufacturing, not the retail, is actually driving a lot of this. And then arts-related software publishing, which I think is worth noting. This is gaming software. This is software related to photo processing, to computer-assisted design. So that's some of what we're talking about here. And then sound recording, of course, and advertising. And again, we try to be stringent because otherwise an enterprise like this would be fairly useless from a research perspective. So we didn't just throw in all of advertising. We actually took out those elements of advertising. That's one of the benefits of working with the Bureau of Economic Analysis. You can actually get very granular detail. Pulled out those elements of advertising that relate to creativity, advertising campaigns, graphic design, that sort of thing. And that's, again, the substantial export the US is responsible for. Let's also look, what does this mean kind of more broadly in terms of the economy in the US? Well, so the magic number for us here is it's about 4%, 4.32% of the US GDP, excuse me. That is pretty substantial, as you'll see, and it's actually about $250 billion of the total final economic value of goods and services. Again, GDP doesn't count what are called intermediary costs or supply chain costs, so it truly is a direct value-added measure of what arts and culture contribute to the economy. Okay, so now those are commodities. What about industries? The contributors here are actually broadcasting, radio and TV broadcasting, internet broadcasting, movies and video industries, of course, are also in the lead, publishing, arts and cultural retail, trade, and performing arts and independent artists. So I would just draw attention to, performing arts and independent artists comprise about $35 billion of the GDP in the US. Now, again, numbers, this is again kind of fun to talk about numbers, but what is the sort of relative value? Well, it's actually hard to get a pretty straightforward international comparison because every country that's doing this kind of thing has its own measures, and some have very defined approaches. Some only look at intellectual property. Some only look at certain kinds of arts and culture. And so we don't really have a great comparison, but I will point out that if you look at this chart, you'll see Australia, in their case, it's about 7% of their GDP. Now, again, not necessarily accounting for the same kinds of arts and cultural goods we are. France, it's 4%. Spain, it's about 3%. And again, I wouldn't put too much stock in the actual numbers, but just to show you that other countries are also rapidly, actually very much engaged in the process of quantifying this so that they can then spur economic development through the arts and through culture and through creativity. So within the US alone, if you wanted to compare. That third bar here represents arts and culture, and I apologize for those of you in the back who can't see the numbers, but again, it's about $700 billion of arts and culture is the dark blue bar there. But I'm just trying to show you within the US what sectors, if you will, arts and culture trumps in terms of value added. It's bigger than transportation and warehousing. It's bigger than construction. It's bigger than mining, utilities, agriculture, a whole slew of industries. It's not quite as big as healthcare, with $1 trillion, but there's something to aspire for, I suppose. But it does actually give you a sense of the scale of arts and culture. And for a lot of people in the US, this is really surprising stuff. I mean, this was picked up by all the financial press and communities. And it's interesting because we may take a lot of this for granted, those of you who love the arts. I hope I'm speaking to a welcome, not hostile audience about arts and culture. So you all probably have kind of assumed a lot of this. But in the US, a lot of people by no means assumed any of this. And it was just it was a matter of showing them the data. So the number of people who work in these industries, the top bar actually tells you, so first of all, US arts and cultural industries employ about close to 5 million workers, and that's not that's within the industries, either as full-time equivalent employees or contracted employees. And what's surprising a little bit is the top bar, government. Government actually accounts for a lot of the workforce in arts and culture, and that's not that surprising when you think about all the public museums, all the libraries, all the other kinds of cultural facilities and services that governments provide. But it again is somewhat of an eye-opener. And I would just ask you all to think about whether in Ireland, to what degree is government contributing directly to that economic growth relative to other sectors. I only have a couple of more findings. One is that arts and cultural commodities account for half the total economic value of all US copyright-intensive industries. So what does that mean? Well, if you looked at a lot of the industries I showed you earlier, you'll note that many of them are really service industries or service providers. There are some manufacturers, we talked about jewelry, silverware, products, goods, but a lot of these are ideas really generated economies and or industries. And the fact that, I think that itself is a huge indicator that arts and culture is at the forefront of ideas development in the US. So what this means here is if you take all the copyright, so there's a term by our US Patent and Trademark Office called copyright intensive industries. Those are those industries that are designated and classified as having typically contributing a lot to the patents roster in the US and intellectual property. Not all of them are arts, as you can imagine. Many of them are outside the arts. But in fact, the whole total economic value of all copyright, of arts and cultural copyright is about half of all copyright in the US. And that's substantial. So it's about out of 869 billion, which is the total pie for value added by all copyright industries in the US, 433 billion comes from arts and cultural goods and services alone. So again, we speak somewhat cavalierly about creative and innovative in terms of the economy, but here's another way to substantiate those claims through data about talking about the ideas-driven basis, the ideas-driven economy that we're talking that's embodied through arts and cultural goods and services. And so, what are those drivers? One thing I just want to show, so broadcasting, motion pictures, video, publishing, again, ideas. Performing arts and independent artists, to our surprise, actually are a very big driver of this copyright-intensive economy, intellectual property, and of course writers, but also independent artists and performing arts sector. So certainly don't write them off when you talk about creativity, the independent struggling artist. And then lastly, when we talk about innovation, let's remember here, and this is sort of my plea to you for you to think about as you go back and how do you kind of operationalize these ideas in your own work in economic development that you may be having in terms of your partnerships in your communities, is to think a little bit about setting up measurement systems early on that will give you the data at the end of the process to be able to quantify what you've done. That seems so standard and basic, but again, maybe it's not as big of an argument making exercise as it is in the US. But in the US, we really need to do a better job, and we're trying to embed these measurement processes early on. What do I mean by that? Just like there's innovation in product development, there's innovation in measurement. And so the US actually is now changed its standards for accounting for certain arts and cultural goods and services. And this is because of international practices, accounting practices. Sounds very boring, but what I can tell you is it translated to a gain of about $76 billion new GDP to the US because for the first time in 2013, I think it was, they started recognizing what they call entertainment, literary, and artistic originals as capital investments rather than as expenditures. And this is part of a long-term debate about how do we account for R&D in our economic system? How do we talk about R&D? How do we talk about software development, which have typically been viewed as expenses? Those things are now being moved into the capital assets category in the US. So I think this kind of speaks to a zeitgeist. There's a development certainly in accounting circles in the US, but I would hope more broadly that in realizing that arts and cultural goods and services, in this case we're talking about stock photography, film scripts, play scripts, greeting card designs, elements that had sort of been written off as expenses now being brought in because they have what are called long-lived benefits. After they've been manufactured, people enjoy them for generations, but that also means additional transactions occurring after the product has been developed. And so that's sort of the gift that keeps on giving that the arts has that we can use to our benefit and think about as you propound the value of arts and culture in Ireland. Thank you very much.